so that the neckline does not stretch while I'm working with it or while it's being worn. After completion, I am taking rayon hem tape and basting it around the neckline on the inside of the blouse. I'm loosely basting it. In other words, my stitches are fairly long and either at the 1/4 inch seam allowance or just inside the 1/4 inch. The facing, when it is sewn, will stabilize this completely, but for now, this is the way to apply it. And I'm not going to go completely around the neck, going over the shoulder seam. I'm going to clip it at the shoulder seam so that the shoulders are free. That way, if I need to make a change at the shoulders, I can do so without taking the whole top apart. Also, the seam allowances on the shoulder seams have not been finished yet, so to lay this tape on top of them would prevent me from being able to finish the seam allowance edges. And up to the seam allowance at the center back. Now you can see how the bottom of the hem tape sticks up. It's too tight, so that will need to be clipped so it lays flat. We don't want to have that neckline being bound up and tight once the facing is applied. I clip at a diagonal because it will fray less than a straight across the grain clip, and about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch. Well, about 1/4. This hem tape is 1/2 of an inch, so up to or close to the basted stitching line, but certainly not through it. And now to finish the edge of the seam allowance on the shoulder seams, I'm using a zigzag, and use whatever size works. I always take a scrap of fabric and test my stitches before I make the garment. This is a fairly sturdy fabric and medium lightweight, of course 2 layers. So my zigzag is about 3/16 to 1/4 of an inch wide, and about 4 to 6 complete zigzags per inch. If I make the zigzag very tight, it will stretch the edge of the seam allowance and it will not lay as flat. And now to finish the other seam allowances with a zigzag. And keep in mind, I'm using contrasting colored thread so that you can see what I'm doing. In normal circumstances, I would use a matching thread. As you can see, I'm just doing a straight zigzag right over the clip marks. The clip marks should not go too close to the very seam so that it creates an area of weakness. But this is not a blouse that would be thrown into the washing machine. It'll either be washed by hand or dry cleaned. So these clip marks shouldn't cause a problem. always go back and trim the little frays that are going past the zigzag if you like. I don't really find this offensive unless it's really bad, so often I'll just leave them or just clip the ones that are the most obvious. Now the neckline, the hemline, and the 2 armholes need to be finished. We have facings for the neckline and the hem, and I'll be doing bias binding around the armholes. The reason I am not going to interface the facing is that we already have the thickness of an interlining, and we have the stabilization of the neckline with the hem tape. And I don't want this top to be very stiff. If I wanted it to be a little stiffer, have a little more body, I could interface the facings. And I would do it with another cotton batiste. You also can use a lightweight fusible if you'd like. And if you use a fusible, what I normally do is cut the seam allowance away from the fusible so that it doesn't go into the seam allowances, creating even more bulk. But in this course, I will not be using fusibles. This particular piece is for the hem. Front, and the other piece is for the back. And this is a normal stitch, 10 to 12 stitches per inch. This is a 3/4 inch seam allowance, like the body, so that if I need to make alterations, I can do so. However, again, seam allowance is somewhat subjective. You can use what you find the best for your fabric and for your taste. These are 1/2 inch seam allowances for the neckline. press the seams flat to embed the stitches into the fabric and then press them open. Right now I'm putting a straight pin at dead center back at the neckline as a reference. Even if there's a notch there, it helps to see that pin. And I'm starting to pin the facing at center front. The shoulder seams. Matching all notches and securing it down all the way around the neckline. You can see that I'm putting a pin on either side of the shoulder seam allowance to keep that seam allowance flat so it doesn't flip to the other side when I sew the facing down to the neckline. Matching a notch. And folding the facing away from center back. It's about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch, and you'll understand why as I work through this. I'll explain it more. And now to secure the facing down to the blouse. It's a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm starting at the center back and working up to the shoulder. Sometimes I start at the shoulder and work down to the center front or center back. However, because I've already put the seam tape around the neckline to stabilize it, I really do think that working either direction on this piece in this segment is fine. I'm also keeping my fingers under the blouse every once in a while to make sure that the seam allowance doesn't flip up from the bottom and get tangled up in the seam. The seam tape needs to lay flat all the way around the neckline. When the facing flips up, you can see this seam tape underneath. And where it was basted, below where it was basted, it could easily flip up and get caught in the seam, and then it would create some bulk. I work down to center front. Now I'm going to start at the shoulder and work around down to center back and then finish the front neckline. Back tack just 1 or 2 stitches so it locks the stitches and the facing doesn't come away. And now the segment from the shoulder back down to center front neckline, I'll finish that area. Be sure to take your pins out before you run over them, because if the needle hits them, it could break and fly up and hit you in the face. That would be the worst case scenario, I think. And the other thing it could do is make a little burr in the needle, which will snag your fabric sometimes. Now look at your stitching, make sure it looks all straight. Embed the stitches with your iron. And clip up to the seam line or very close to it. Just be careful not to go through the seam line. Now, most of these clips I'm doing straight rather than diagonally, and that's fine because when this facing is flipped over, there will be no abrasion to make it more apt to fray. It'll be protected. Now I'm going to press the seam open. Sometimes fabrics fray enough that it doesn't makes sense to try and press them open. It creates more fraying. If that's the case, just press the seam allowance up into the facing area. Oh, yeah, up into the facing area. But I want to try to press this one open. It's a pretty sturdy fabric. What I've decided to do, however, is use a wooden tool because the wood absorbs the moisture. It'll help pull the moisture through the fabric and press the seam. And this is a smaller surface, so I can more easily get to that seam without smashing the rest of the body with the iron. And like I said, if this seam allowance is too tricky, for instance, if I was using a silk chiffon, it would be very difficult to press this open without creating much fraying and perhaps smashing some of the blouse. So in that case, I would just press the seam up into the facing. Now, folding the facing to the inside of the blouse, I'm going to press again. By pressing the seam open first, this press should be nice and flat. By pinning it down, it stabilizes it and gives me a chance to work on a larger surface. You'll be able to tell where areas need more clipping because they won't lay very flat. You see how that roll is right where I'm pressing. You want that to be super flat. There. Mostly I just hovered the iron over, or lightly touch it. Pulling out basting threads that show. You can see if you look at the shoulder seam, you can see the facing's wide enough to go almost from the neckline to the shoulder seam, which will really cover that shoulder seam nicely. Now what I did was I just, see there, I pressed the seam allowance at the center back open, folded it in. I'm going to do it on this side. When the zipper's in, it'll look like that. And then the facing, not coming all the way to the center back, allows that nice space for the zipper. A lot of home sewing patterns teach just to take the facing all the way to center back. But then you kind of run into a problem when you want to zip up the zipper. It gets kind of stuck in that area. So this will help. Now what I want to do is edge stitch a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch away from the seam allowance in the facing. And what I'm capturing is the facing and the seam allowance under it. You can see right there. But I'm also going to try to leave the, as I'm opening the seam tape, the hem tape, I want that to lay flat, the same orientation that it was originally basted down. Okay? Otherwise, it just creates extra bulk. See, again, I'm opening with my finger, my thumb, that seam tape so it lays flat. And I'm capturing with the stitching the facing and the seam allowance. The seam allowance is sewn into the facing. And then when the facing's turned down, that particular stitching that I'm doing helps keep the facing inside the garment. It helps keep the facing from rolling out as it's worn or when it's laundered or dry cleaned and then again pressed or ironed. Now, I want to close up the center back so I can insert the zipper. From the bottom of the blouse up to the bottom of the zipper, that will be a normal stitch, 10 to 12 stitches per inch. And then where the zipper is actually going to be inserted, that will be a basting stitch, which will be about 6 to 8 stitches per inch. So here's my zipper, normal nylon coiled zipper. And I'm going to take it to that pin. I'll be shortening the zipper. So from the bottom, this turns out to be a 3/4 inch seam allowance, but again, that's subjective, whatever your seam allowance is. From the bottom up to where the bottom of the zipper will be, or the end of the zipper, a normal stitch. Back tack 1 or 2 stitches. Loosen your stitch to be a basting stitch. Do not back tack because this will come out once the zipper's inserted. And stitch to the top. I'm going to leave a long tail at the top and then take a needle and stitch with that long tail to close the top semi-permanently, just so I can get the zipper in, and then I'll open up the whole back seam to the bottom of the zipper. You want to make sure that the top left and right are equal, that the top and the center back from both sides matches perfectly. One's not higher than the other. Now you'll see me take a needle and thread, or take the thread from that tail and thread the needle, and then take 1 or 2 stitches just to secure it so it doesn't open up while I'm putting the zipper in. This is probably 1 or 2 stitches more than are necessary, but I tend to do that. The basting thread I'm taking out there is what's holding the interlining to the red fabric, just so it doesn't interfere. First embed the stitches and then press the seam open. Eventually we'll learn to put in an invisible zipper, but for now these zippers are soft and more flexible. I really enjoy putting them in blouses like this or in corsetry or dresses that are zipped up the side because they're not stiff like an invisible zipper. And this also will give you the practice of doing the back stitch. It's also a prick stitch. It's a back stitch that becomes, instead of a long stitch, a tiny little prick stitch. Looking to the place that the zipper will stop, I'm going to mark that. And I'm going to put the zipper stop just a fraction below the very top edge, excluding seam allowance. In other words, when the garment is finished, I don't want that zipper stop, that little metal piece, to come all the way to the top, because then the zipper will show, and if it's a fraction, like 1/8 of an inch below the top, it will just lay much more nicely. And I'm taking the teeth and butting them right up to the seam. The teeth are not overlapping the seam, they're completely just next to the seam, butted right up to it. Now what I'm going to do is baste this by hand. You can also do it by machine. I really love doing handwork. I feel like I have a lot more control because sometimes the machine will fight you, and this way I know that my stitches will be where I want them to be and as snug as I want them to be. So I'm starting where the zipper will finally end, and I'm just doing a running stitch in and out, about 1/4 of an inch away from the teeth. Most zippers, most plain nylon zippers, will have a hard edge. It's almost like a stitching line, about 1/4 of an inch away from the teeth, and you can use that as your guideline. Or you can chalk it, but after many years of work, you get pretty good at eyeballing different amounts. And this is just to stabilize it for the time being. Now, make sure your seam allowance lays super flat and baste down the other side. Basically the same way that you did the first side, except on this side I'm starting at the top and working down. There are countless ways of putting zippers in. This is only one. We'll be addressing different ways throughout the course, and you may find ways that are very good for you that are different from what I do. Whatever works for you is fine. Now cut the bottom of the zipper. I cut the bottom about an inch or so below where I want the sewing of the zipper to stop. And I'm taking a piece of hem tape and wrapping it around that. And then I'll stitch it. This will keep the zipper from opening up at the bottom. It'll have a nice finish and stabilize it. So I'm just rolling it so that the edges are underneath the zipper, as you see. Sometimes I do this with bias binding. And just close up the little box. I'm going all the way through the zipper tape. And now, if for some reason the zipper was unzipped, if the zipper pull went all the way down, it would still stop. There would be something to stop it, and the zipper wouldn't fall apart. You can do this by machine or by hand. Now that little edge is going to have to be folded under. I can do this by machine, but I want to show you how to do it by hand because it's much easier. You have much more control. I'm folding the seam allowance and the top of the zipper tape inside. and then folding the facing down on top of it. Yep. I'll go back to the zipper in a while, but now I'm going to finish the hemline with its facing. I missed a seam, so I have to sew that. The bottom hem does not have an opening, and I had left, it looks like the center back open. And right sides together, you have to figure out the orientation. I'm starting on the side seam, but you can start anywhere you want. Center front, center back, side seams. And pin it down all the way around, and then we'll stitch it. You can see the blouse is really starting to take shape. And of course, if I didn't mention it before, these are right sides together. And to stitch it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance with a normal stitch, 10 to 12 stitches per inch or more if you desire. So sewing at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, checking to make sure that the seams underneath stay open and flat. Sometimes I have to lift the foot up if there's a little mound of fabric that would be hard to stitch, so I just lift it up and help it go across that stitch. And instead of backpacking, I just overlap the stitches for about 1/2 inch or so. Now, to trim the threads and then clip the curves. On the side seam area, the curves are much more extreme, so I'll clip closer, and across the center, front, and back is fairly flat, so you don't have to clip as often. What I mean is you don't have to make as many clips. It's mostly the deep curves that are a problem. When turning the fabric, it has to be clipped or it will not press flat. This seam would be difficult to press open because of the tight curves on the side seam. So I'm simply pressing the seam allowance up into the facing. Be sure to test your iron on a scrap of fabric. Some irons will leave a shine on the fabric, and in that case you definitely need to use a press cloth, a piece of fabric like a piece of lightweight linen without a lot of texture to it, or cotton that's been washed to get the sizing out, and you put it between the iron and the fashion fabric. You can see how I'm putting the tight curve at the narrow end of this hem because it'll shape around the hem and I can get a better pressed finish. Now to turn up the facing, and I also want to roll it in just a fraction so that the seam allowance isn't at the very, very edge. It rolls in just a tiny bit. In other words, you can see the seam, right? The seam, and then about a 32nd of an inch of fabric before the fold. The seam isn't right on the fold. It's a little inside the garment. This I do with all facings. Right there. You can see the seam. It's rolled in just a tiny bit, maybe a 1/16 of an inch. Pulling out some basting threads. And now I'm going to do the understitching on the hem facing to hold the seam allowance to the facing. so that it doesn't have a problem when worn. So again, this is edge stitching. I'm putting the needle through the fabric of the facing and all seam allowances, all layers of seam allowance. And I keep checking underneath to make sure that the seam goes up into the facing and doesn't flip-flop back into the garment. The stitching is about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. The closer to the edge, the flatter it will usually be after sewn. So, discussing the edge of the facings now and the armholes, they have to be finished. I'm going to make bias for the armhole, so I need to be reminded of what this armhole measurement is, and I'll cut bias strips of the same fabric. I need at least 21 inches plus a little overlap. So this piece is about, let's see, 20 or 21 square. What I want to do is just make sure it's a square. And folding it diagonally like this to create a triangle, the fold needs to be the minimum of the armhole measurement. I could piece it together if it was shorter, but I prefer only using one piece. Now, just to make this a perfect triangle without it slipping while I'm ironing it, I'm pinning the edges together. The fold is a perfect 45-degree angle and will be perfect bias. So as you see, the left edge is sticking out a little bit. So I didn't measure carefully. One side is half an inch longer than the other. That's no problem. Just bring the edges together as I show and press the diagonal. The diagonal is still a 45-degree angle. Comparing the length of the diagonal fold to the armhole measurement is what I was doing, making sure that this is going to be a long enough piece once it's cut. I'm marking 1.25 inches, and then I'll cut the fold, so I'll have 2 strips. I prefer to cut these bindings a little wider than I might need. Sometimes I make them quite a bit extra wide, but it's much easier to trim them down when they're sewn rather than have a narrow one that's harder to work with. And as I mentioned, cut the fold. Now I have 2 strips. By taking this tabletop away, I have a free arm on my sewing machine, so the armhole will be much more easily sewn by taking the table away, as you'll see in a moment. I'm cutting the diagonal off. I'm starting underneath the arm, right sides together, and folding a little end back. And I'm making this snug, but I'm not pulling it tight. Bias has a tendency to stretch, but if you stretch it too far, then your garment will gather in when you release the stretch. By turning that edge over, that will serve as a seam finish. You can see it's snug, but I'm not pulling it tight. What happens when you go around a curve? Sometimes, because it's all biased, the fabric stretches or it pushes together, and then when you pull it away from the stitching, you'll see that because it's stretched, elongated, that you haven't captured the exact seam allowance that you want. You might have gone over or under. So I'll address that in a few minutes. Right here, you can see it got to be a little bit more than 1/4 inch in one area and a little bit less in another. Right there it's less. And yeah, so I'll just go over it and then take out the old stitching. It's the same with bias. If you take a piece of bias tape and pull on it, it gets narrower. If you push on it slightly, it gets a little wider. That's what happens when I'm going around this armhole. And repeating the same process on the other armhole. And then trimming the excess so that it overlaps the final stitching piece of fabric, overlaps the folded piece just a little, 1 inch, 1/2 inch. Pressing to embed the stitches. And clipping and trimming. So clip all the way around the armhole. It's a gentle curve, but it is a curve. And now I'm going to press the seam allowance up into the bias. The bias is, you can call it a facing. It's acting as a facing, but it's going to be bias that is turned under and will not show from the outside of the blouse. Just taking out some basting stitching that shows. And now to do the edge stitching like I did on the hem facing and the neck facing. I'm sewing the seam allowance up into the bias, edge stitching a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. And again, this helps hold the seam allowance to the bias so that it doesn't roll out, or the bias doesn't roll out and show once it's completely sewn and finished. Back tack 1 or 2 stitches. And now fold the bias to the inside of the garment and press it flat. And just like the neckline and the hemline, you can roll it so that the seam is a fraction on the inside of the garment, not at the very edge of the fold. Now you can see it's tight, but I'm not going to clip it because the edges of this, the raw edges, will be folded under. As you see, I'm wrapping it around the seam allowance and then back down. You can pin it all the way through all layers. When I go to sew it, I will try not to get the outside layer of linen, but just catch the bias to the interlining of the garment. And what a nice finishing this is for an armhole. I'm going to cut this off a little bit, trim it because it's a little deeper than it needs to be. Doing my double fold and then pressing and pinning down. So now to trim the neckline facing and the hem facing with bias. I'm taking a piece of China silk, also called habit-tie. I have about 3/4 of a yard at 45 inches wide. I want to get a general idea of how long a piece I will need for each. So I'm measuring basically the edge, the unfinished edge of the neck facing. I measured from center back to center front and doubled it. And now I will measure the hem facing. Also, I will do the zipper on both sides of the zipper. So I'm writing these measurements down just so that I don't forget them. It's very easy to forget measurements very quickly, at least it is for me. This is about 3/4 of a yard, and what I'm doing is, if you can make it a perfect square, just fold it into a triangle. It's very slippery fabric, so you have to just take your time and be very careful with it. And then with a dry iron or little steam, since I'm ironing directly on the table, I'm not using any steam at all, just pressing the crease of the fold. And this fold line is perfect 45-degree angle bias fabric. I want to pull this into as straight a line as possible. Again, it's very slippery, so it's sometimes a little more difficult than other fabrics to work with. I'm going to make these strips 1 1/4 inch wide, and what I'm doing is just using a light pencil and going across it with my ruler at 1 1/4 inch, and then I'll cut strips, and I'll also cut on the fold line. And if I pin inside the 1 1/4 inch, this will stabilize it for cutting because it's really slippery when you cut it. It wants to move around. You can certainly use a lightweight cotton, or you can even purchase bias for binding the edges. But I really love using this particular lightweight silk. It's not an expensive silk. It's paper thin and wraps seams just beautifully. Another good fabric would be crepe de chine, silk crepe de chine. So again, from the original or the first pencil markings, I'm going up another 1 1/4 inch. So I'm making 2 rows of lines, 1.25 inches and 1.25 inches above that. So this way, while this fabric is stabilized on the table, I can cut it, because being what we call China silk or habitai, it's very, very slippery and lightweight. So once I move it, it would be very hard to get it back to the table in this orientation. So I'm just doing 1.25 inches, 1.25 inches, 1.25 inches. And now by pinning it, I can cut on the fold, and the remaining piece will still be intact for later use. So as you can see, my pieces will be about 40, 41, and about 39. So these are nice long pieces, and once they're cut, they'll actually relax and stretch a little bit. Not that I'll be pulling them, but they just naturally stretch. Cutting on the fold. Now, see how I'm making these at right angles and sewing them together, or pinning them first. If I sew across this line where I'm pinning, this is a good way to join this type of bias if you need it to be longer than one strip, because the seam will be on the bias or on the diagonal and will lay flatter than if you just sewed it straight down. You'll see in a moment. I'm pulling the thread behind so it'll feed through the machine, otherwise it's too lightweight to feed through. And now you see how it's one straight piece. I've joined two pieces. The seam is diagonal, 45 degrees. I laid the fabric, the two pieces at right angles, and sewed across diagonally. And now that seam allowance will be distributed in such a way when sewn onto the garment that as not to create bulk. I'm going to start at center back. Just like the armhole binding, I'm folding, cutting so I have a right angle at the edge, folding it under, which will be the seam finishing, laying it on the right side of the fabric with the fold up and stitching at 1/4 inch. And I'm making this snug. I'm not pulling it tight, but I'm making it nice and snug. And here's the join. Let the final bias overlap the folded piece at least 1 inch. There are a few places, again, where the seam became too narrow, so I'm just going back over it to make sure I get the adequate amount of seam allowance. checking to make sure everything's laying correctly. Pressing the bias up, making sure the seam allowance underneath it is pressed up as well. Now I'm wrapping the silk down over the seam allowance. That seam allowance is still facing up, and the edge of the seam allowance is at the fold of the silk. Doesn't that look nice? This is going to be a beautiful finish. If you want even a finer, a narrower finish, just trim the seam allowance to about 1/8 of an inch. But I'm going to leave the seam allowance just as it is, and we'll have a nice 1/4 inch binding. I'm clipping extra areas, or areas where there's extra thick fabric it needs to wrap around so it's not bulky. You don't need to clip anything, the little vertical clips that we do on armholes and such, because we're just wrapping this around the seam allowance. It's not, the seam allowance isn't being turned under. Now what I'm going to do is called stitch in the ditch. You see where I have embedded the needle, right where the two colors meet, and stitch right there. That's called the ditch. By doing so, I am securing the silk underneath where it is wrapped around underneath, it's wider than 1/4 of an inch. So by stitching in the ditch, it catches all layers and secures that binding to the edge of the fabric. Because bias tends to want to slip, what I'm also doing is, you'll probably see me do it, see if I can show you where, right where I'm holding it with my right thumb, I kind of push the fabric back under. In other words, I want it to hug snug to the edge of that seam allowance. So I continually check it, wrap it tight, and hold it. Otherwise, it's going to squeeze out and be a lot wider than I want it to be. There's the join again, and you see it's at a nice diagonal. I also want to wrap the seam going down the center back. Well, that little bit slipped out, so I could put it back under the sewing machine, but I can also show you how to just tack it down by hand. I'm just catching it through the layers of the linen. I'm not going all the way back out to the outside. And this is fine. The way this will be finished, the final stitching, it will be completely secure. So this is not going to make it less quality by not doing it on the sewing machine. I want to go around the neck facing in the same fashion. This piece is plenty long enough. I'm unfolding the facing at the center back and starting from the edge of the facing, sewing the bias at 1/4 of an inch, just like I did the hem facing. It's the same process. Just a little mistake in the stitching, so I'll take that out and start again. And on the other side, folding the linen out, so I'm going to sew this silk all the way to the very edge. That way, when I fold the linen back under, it will help finish the edge of the silk as well. Embedding the stitches by pressing. Taking out that stitching where I corrected, just taking out the one I don't need. And again, just like the hem facing, I am rolling the silk over around the raw edge of the linen and pressing it. And again, stitching in the ditch. You can see with my right hand, I keep pushing my thumb under the silk, pushing it towards the garment so it wraps nice and tightly, because it wants to actually kind of bounce away from the fabric. So I want to keep it wrapped really tightly while I put it under the needle. There you go, you can see it. You can see that I'm putting the straight pins through all layers. If this was a fine, fragile silk that was interlined as this blouse is, I would not go all the way to the outer layer. I would just catch my pins through the facing to the interlining. Now what I'm doing is comparing those shoulders to make sure that they're the same width. It's very easy when you're making a garment to make one side of the shoulder a little narrower than the other, depending on how much you folded the fabric under with the seam allowance. So it's a good idea to compare these things to make sure everything's symmetrical. Now I want to finish the back seam for the zipper. I actually could have done this in the very beginning, right after I put the zipper in, but I didn't, and it's easy to do it now. I haven't sewn the facings down at the neck or the hemline, so it shouldn't be a problem. You may have to switch to a zipper foot, a sliding zipper foot, to get close enough. It just depends on if your regular sewing foot is the right width to do this. If it's a problem, you should have other feet that you can put on your machine. And again, I'm sewing not quite 1/4 of an inch, but close to 1/4, straight down, and I'm using bias. However, because this is a straight seam, not a curved seam, instead of using bias, I could use the same fabric but cut on the straight grain. Either way would be fine. Pulling the bottom of the zipper away from my needle. And this does not have to go to the very bottom. Because the facing will cover it, I just need to go down into the facing area a little bit. As you see, I cut it off, so that's fine. I'll repeat the process on the other side of the zipper. When the facing is turned up and stitched down, it will cover these raw edges of the white silk. And lightly pressing the silk so it's nice and flat. And wrapping it around the edge of the fabric. Giving it a little bit of steam. You don't want to put too much heat on the zipper. It could melt it. And as you see, the hem is inside the blouse so that I'm not pressing the front of the blouse, only the back zipper area. If I had wrapped the zipper area like this before I applied the hem facing and the neck facing, I would probably just have stitched in the ditch. But what I'm doing so that it's easy is stitching from the back, just doing a little running stitch, not going through all layers, but catching, let's see, I'm catching the silk and the underlining. I'm trying not to go out to the outside layer. And this will secure it down before the final stitching. Trying to get this under a sewing machine needle with the facings already on would be quite a bear. It'd be very difficult to handle it. And this goes, look how fast this goes. It just goes so quickly. The final stitching will actually stitch the silk to the interlining. As you will see shortly. What a nice finish. I also can secure the bottom of the zipper so it doesn't remain loose and flop around. Now I'm folding the little edge at the top under the seam allowance, a 1/4 inch of the edge, wrapping the tape of the zipper that goes beyond the zipper stop, wrapping it around and down the seam allowance, cutting some of the excess of the facing inside, folding up that little piece of silk so it doesn't show, And now look how lovely that is, all these bias pieces coming together and wrapping the seams. I'm trying to teach many different techniques, and that way you can choose what you feel is appropriate for the garment you're making, for the fabric you're using, and for the time that you want to invest. Some of these techniques are incredibly time consuming, so you may want to go and use a simpler method at times, and other times use something that's a little more intricate. So here we have the seams wrapped. You can see that the blouse is almost completed. Just realigning a few pins so that it lays very nicely. As you see, I'm going through only the binding and the interlining. I'm trying not to go all the way through all layers. But this kind of linen, it wouldn't be a problem if I did.